We'll take you live now to Melbourne. Now, we've had the government today announce, of course, more support for small businesses, including $500,000 in concessional loans, that's up to $50,000 in grants for those small businesses recovering from the bushfires. Brendan O'Connor, Labor's spokesperson, is now responding. Let's listen in.
Support to provide to small businesses in the form of $50,000 grants, or up to $50,000 grants, and indeed supports the loans that will be low interest loans up to $500,000. These things should help small businesses. But I want to be very, very clear here. This has to happen as soon as possible. There is a need for speed when it comes to dealing with small business. Small businesses in this country rely on cash flow. And already we have businesses in this country that have been affected by fires for months, not just days and not just weeks. And as a result of that, we know that there are businesses on the edge of collapse. In fact, I'm advised there are businesses already contemplating closing down. Those businesses that rely upon accommodation, tourism, are so badly affected and can't see a way forward, need support from federal, state and local government, and frankly need support from all Australians to visit these affected areas, if safe to do so, as soon as possible. And again, we join the government and invite Australians, whenever they're taking holidays, to think about these areas and think about visiting them over the course of this year. I also want to pay tribute or acknowledge the efforts of larger businesses who've said they're going to hold conferences and have other events in areas that are directly affected. But I want to say this too. I think it's incumbent on commercial landlords and energy suppliers to reduce or delay the need for small businesses to pay for those very expensive costs. The problem we have now with small businesses is they have no revenue in some cases, or little revenue, or reduced revenue, but their bills keep coming in. So for that reason, of course we welcome the announcement, but we need to know the following questions. First of all, how quickly will this money get to those small businesses? Secondly, who does it apply to? And the fact is, it talks about directly and indirectly affected small businesses, but it's really important that small businesses know whether they can actually access this support. And therefore, there needs to be clear guidelines. Now, having looked at the government website, I've yet to see any guidelines, any parameters, any detail, any forms to fill out for small businesses to make application for either grants or loans. That has to happen immediately. It is already delayed, and therefore it has to happen immediately. As I said, there is a need for speed when it comes to supporting small businesses, or it will be too late. They don't have the wherewithal to last for weeks and months without sufficient revenue. Those that know about small business know they work on small or very tiny margins, and therefore the support has to get to them as quickly as possible. We need to know the answers to those questions, and Labor is willing to work, of course, with government. If there are any changes required in the Parliament to support businesses and small businesses, we want to be there. And the other thing I want to note is this. To date, we welcome the fact there's going to be some support for volunteers for their wages that have been lost, up to $6,000 for those employees who've been employed by small businesses. But we are concerned about the amount of casuals and permanent part-time workers that may lose their jobs. Those workers spend all their money in those communities, and that's a double whammy for those communities, because not only are their businesses suffering, if there's no wages, there's no expenditure, you see a decline in stimulation of the local economy, which will compound this very difficult challenge for these regions of this country. So firstly, I make very clear, we welcome the announcement. We want it to move as quickly as possible. We need to provide the advice. For example, the announcement talks about 10 financial advisors, and yet there are, as I'm advised, up to 192,000 businesses in these affected areas. Now, clearly, 10 financial advisors will not be enough to provide the advice that these businesses need to get the support they're after. So we'd have to say to the government, you might have to look at that issue again. Further, there needs to be boots on the ground. We need the resources in the affected areas. Yes, people can help from Canberra, and they can help from Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Brisbane, but they need to happen in the regions. They have to be with the businesses, talking to them at the place where their businesses exist, because otherwise you're going to have a disconnect. And again, I call upon the government to set up a business task force, as happened in 2011 with the Queensland floods, to ensure that the engagement is ongoing, because this is not going to end in days or weeks or possibly even months. This will go on for some time. These communities are hurting. Small businesses are in deep trouble of going to the wall, and we need the government to step up. And of course, the final question we do have of the government, and we're talking to small businesses ourselves, and we've been listening to small businesses for the last 6 months, but I have to say, in this new year, we'll be focusing on the listening tour, talking to bushfire-affected small businesses, is what is it they're doing? What else do small businesses need that hasn't been mentioned in this announcement? We really have to listen closely, because, as the government likes to say, small businesses are the backbone of the economy. Well, we better protect this vibrant sector of our economy, not just for those small businesses, but the people they employ, the communities that are beneficiaries of their business. And before I take any questions, I just need to, as I'd been asked earlier, I need to just make a comment on the conduct of Minister Bridget McKenzie in relation to the grants that she dealt with prior to the election. It is clear that there is corruption, political corruption involved, insofar as the conduct of the minister in dealing with these applications. There's no doubt that, having looked at what's been said by the auditor, that the Auditor General, that is, we have a problem with the way in which the government has dealt with this matter. It's clear that they've politicised and corrupted the process for political gain, and that, of course, has been dismissed this morning and this week by Scott Morrison. But the fact is, Scott Morrison clearly would have known the way in which these grants were dealt with, because he was the campaigner-in-chief for the Liberal Party at the last election. He would have been going around spruiking the benefits of these grants, and it's hard to believe he was not aware of the processes that were involved, at least to some extent. So he should firstly stand aside his minister for her conduct, which is unconscionable and indeed in breach of the Ministerial Code of Conduct. He must explain fully to the Australian people his role or his involvement, and indeed his knowledge insofar as these applications were concerned, because they were used for political and electoral purposes during the election campaign, and he was campaigner-in-chief, and it beggars belief that he was not aware, at least to some extent, about the way in which those matters were managed by his minister, given he was so much involved in the announcements and references to those announcements when campaigning. That's another thing I needed to add. But again, if I can just finish, we need to move very quickly as a country in response to these devastating fires. People are hurting. I was in Kangaroo Island last week. I want to thank Dion and Linda Buick, who took me around to the most devastated, affected areas of Kangaroo Island, talking to farmers and small businesses. They are hurting. The stories I heard to fight fires, the stories of survival that I heard were quite harrowing and heroic. But what they need now is a government that will step up for them. And that's why it's important that we see that happen effectively and quickly, because if that doesn't happen, then we're going to see further devastation of an economic kind, which would be a terrible thing given what they've already experienced to date. Happy to take any questions.
What sort of support would you like to see for business indirectly affected by these bushfires?
Well, I think firstly we need to look at who are we looking at to support here? To whom are we providing support? Of course, first and foremost, you look to those businesses which have lost their businesses because of fire. they've lost their businesses, their shop or their general store, or part of their business has been burnt as a result of fire. That would be the first response, to deal with that. They may have lost their home. Their home may have been their collateral for their small business, if you think about it that way too. Thousands of homes gone, and we need to make sure we respond to that for small business. Secondly, what we shouldn't do is assume that if your area wasn't evacuated, that somehow you're not affected. We know that there are businesses, in fact I spoke to Susan Templeman, the member for Macquarie, this morning. She has restaurants and cafes in her electorate where the fires didn't directly hit, but because of the fires in the Blue Mountains, nobody came. Nobody came, no patrons came to those. I believe that those businesses who have lost their revenue as a result of the failure, or the result, I should say, not of the failure, but the result of those fires, should be properly considered.